Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, April 11th, another extraordinarily busy week for news from around the world. We'll start with the news everyone has been talking about, Trump's tariffs. They were on and then they were off. Other tariffs remain in place, even as some were postponed for 90 days. But when things settle down towards the end of the week, at least we think they are settling down, the actual U.S. tariffs still in place were, according to one calculation, the highest since 1904. So what happened this week? Why did Trump cave, or did he cave? And what can we expect next? Then another set of tariffs that was really never turned off. Indeed, they were increased almost on a daily basis. Tariffs on Chinese imports. First it was 10%, then 20%, then 64%, then 104%, and now they're at 145% for goods entering the U.S. market from China. At every turn, China responded, raising its tariffs now on U.S. imports to 125%. But it said they're done. The U.S. has been effectively priced out of the Chinese market. So will this trade war lead to the big deal that Trump says he wants, or will it, as past trade wars have, lead to the kind of confrontation that sometimes lead to actual real wars? We'll talk about that. And then finally, another set of talks are starting tomorrow between the United States and Iran, this time to try to end Iran's nuclear program. The time for talks is pressing because Iran is accelerating the production of enriched uranium. And later this year, the 10-year clock on sanctions that was part of the original deal that Trump abandoned in 2018 will expire. And that raises real questions for the Europeans who are party to that older agreement. So what can we expect to come out of these bilateral discussions between the United States and Iran? Here to help us make sense of this week's events are three reporters who are covering those stories. Liz Sly is a journalist at large and formerly contributor, reporter at the Washington Post. Giles Whittell is world affairs editor of Tortoise Media, and Prashant Rao is senior editor at Semaphore. Good afternoon to, in fact, all of you here, because I'm in the afternoon too. I'm in Greece, and you are all three in London, believe it or not. But our audience is watching from all over the world. So great to see you all. Liz, wonderful to have you on the show. You've been on the show before, but I haven't, not when I hosted. So it's wonderful to have you here as well. Giles, let's start with you. Tariff week, I think we can call it. It really was quite an extraordinary week when you think about it. It actually started last week with Liberation Day, but this was the time when when what was announced on April 2nd began to be implemented, or not. Just can you take us through the last week or so? What happened, and where do you think we are?
I can try. It's been like having your head over a fire hose of news. You used the word whiplash. I thought I'd just pick out a couple of scenes and statistics that have stuck with me that I'll remember from this week, which might be a good starting point. I guess the first is, I think, Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. in the White House. Trump tweets, "It's a good time to buy," and he uses the ticker for his personal Trump-related stocks. 3 hours later, he rescinds the threatened tariffs, the ones first proposed on Liberation Day the week before. And the stock market begins its epic rally. Later that day, I think it was in the Roosevelt Room in the White House, he hosts a number of billionaires, including Charles Schwab from the eponymous investment house, and delights in telling a live camera how many millions or billions he and others had recouped in that day's rally. A number that will stick with me is 62%, the share of Americans who are invested in the equities, in US equities, either directly or through their pensions. So this is personal for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of Americans who may not have recovered personally in the way Charles Schwab did. And it's personal for people around the world. I have a modest pension accrued as a jobbing journalist over a number of decades, heavily invested in US stocks because that's where the growth has been. I'm significantly poorer, looking forward to significantly straightened retirement as a result of this week. Then, as you mentioned, in fact, the recovery tapered off fairly quickly. It turns out that the overall burden of tariffs on imports into the US is not lower as a result of Trump's change of heart a week after Liberation Day. It's higher. By our count, it taught us about 4.2% higher. And that's a simple function of the fact that Chinese trade accounts for so much of the total. And as the French member of the European Central Bank noted, even though markets recovered some of what they'd given up, as far as the world is concerned, we are left with the unpredictability of US policymaking, where for most of the past 70 years, we have been used to predictability, and protectionism as the default stance of this administration, however it chooses to enact it. And macroeconomically, I don't speak as an expert, but it's pretty clear that the dollar is no longer necessarily a safe haven for currency speculators. And US federal debt, the legendary 10-year Treasury bond, is no longer one of the safest investments in the world. These are epoch-making changes. And I just offer one final observation from this side of the Atlantic as to the optics of the charade of the past 10 days. And this is what is perhaps most dispiriting, quite apart from the numbers. I've written in my notebook the words mass psychosis. You have two kinds of people around Trump, it seems to me. The sycophants, but more troubling, the smart people who should know better. Smart people rationalizing dumb policies. And this is the very opposite of reassuring. So you started, Ivo, by asking me where this goes next. I don't know, but I think it's smart to be concerned.
I think, Liz, that sums it up. No one really knows, and I think part of the reason is this was a crisis, unlike, say, the run on U.S. Treasuries and bond yields in 2008 during the financial crisis, and in 2020 after COVID. This was the result of a decision of one man. This was not something that was external. It was highly deliberate, and we saw trust evaporating in what was the most trustful thing that we have long had, which is the U.S. dollar.
Well, yes, I think that although it's impossible to say what's going to happen in the short term, and there's a very real danger, I'm not an economist either, but I understand a few of these basics a bit better than to have done what the Trump administration did in the past. And one of the things that, and so we don't know if this is going to lead to economic collapse of the world, we're all going to lose our money, all of it, or whether it's going to stabilize and somehow play out. But I think one long-term trend that's irreversible is the loss of trust in the United States. And that is not going to come back ever. It doesn't matter that if you say that Trump's only going to be there for 4 years, another administration comes in, reverses all of this. Now we know we are on a course where we cannot rely on the US to make decisions on behalf of the rest of the world and as the leader of the world. But I think what we've got is a world that at the moment is, other countries are trying to salvage their own situation vis-a-vis Trump, but everyone's got an eye on decoupling from America, maybe separating from the dollar, and that is not going to come back.
Yeah, Prashant, it strikes me that's a really, really important observation. Is I think the realization by countries that because trust has been broken, they now need to find alternatives. And it turns out that they may have alternatives, even to the dollar, when it ultimately comes down to it. And I'm here in Greece at a conference at the Delphi Economic Forum, and Martin Wolf was one of the speakers today, the great economic commentator in the Financial Times, and actually took very serious the possibility of the euro in 10 years or so becoming the reserve currency of the world. What does it tell us about power, and American power, and America's leadership, and that the reaction is, the Canadian new prime minister goes to Europe on his first visit and not to Washington, because he no longer can trust the United States.
Yeah, there are a few things to add on. This is kind of coming full circle. My first job in journalism was as a bond market reporter, and so this is all sort of really drawing back on some things that are firmly lodged in the far reaches of my brain. But I think you're absolutely right. So much of this is about power. And, the old cliche that it takes decades to sort of grow a forest and only, a brief period to burn it all down. I think, one of the fascinating things about this is, the treasury market is different from the stock market in that there are no CEOs to bully. There are no companies that you can sort of defenestrate. There is just the market. And it is, as my colleague Liz Hoffman wrote yesterday, the crypto president was undone by decentralized finance. Bond traders, defenestrated Bill Clinton in the 90s, and they did the same to Donald Trump, this week. And so it's really important to just think about that fact that, it is something of a check. We kind of know now where Trump's own power stops. With regards to how far he can go in his tariff policy. We see the outer bounds now of what can be done and what he may be able to do. That being said, what has been striking is the lack of legislative discussion about this tariff policy, which suggests that it is all temporal, right? It can go and vanish and come back again. So we are in this 90-day reprieve, but it's really, more of a limbo, right? We don't know what will happen in 90 days. So if I was the CEO of a company with, huge amounts of capital expenditure to make, I certainly wouldn't be making in the next 90 days. And then you can reasonably raise the question of whether you do it over the next 3.5 years, because why couldn't this happen again in, August or October or the same time next year? This tariff uncertainty is persistent simply because, unlike Smoot-Hawley, there is no legislative backing, there is no consistency. And so it is really hard to imagine investing in the United States or investing in sort of trading in the United States. So what we see is a lot of countries are shifting. The examples you cite, even more recent ones, the European Union opened trade negotiations with the UAE today. The South China Morning Post reports that the European Union is planning a trip to China in July. The Spanish Prime Minister is in Beijing today. The EU has restructured its trade negotiation structure to try and finish a first-part trade deal with India by the end of the year. This is astonishingly fast by European Union standards. And it opened its UAE deal negotiations today and wants to close them by the end of the year. This is, just unbelievably fast. The EU itself is changing its institutional structure on trade to pass, sort of token deals quickly because it sees that it needs to restructure how it moves. All of these things are happening all at once. And, the entire question comes, well, what does the president want out of this? What is going to satisfy him? Aside from, a balance of trade. And, the sort of 10% balance, the UK, for example, is a great example in the sense of the UK has a trade surplus with the United States, but still has a 10% tariff. So actually trade balance and trade surplus is also insufficient. And so I guess that is, we are left more with questions than any sense of answers.
Yeah, I think you raised.
I would just like to add there as another example. This isn't about trade imbalances for sure, because of the UK example and Saudi Arabia, which has a big trade deficit with America. Saudi Arabia buys a lot of cars from America. Cars is one of Trump's big things. He wants the whole world to buy American cars. Nobody else does because they're all tiny. I mean, they're all enormous in it. And Europe has tiny streets. Japan has tiny streets. They don't want big lumbering American cars, but Saudi Arabia does because it has big wide roads and open desert and long distance. And they got 17% tax. And Trump loves MBS. So one thing you can say is that this is not about correcting trade deficits or imbalances.
Yeah, I think that's.
It's about a love of tariffs. It's about tariffs for tariff's sake. It's about looking important and throwing your weight around.
Well, it's about two other things that they have argued. Of course, one is to bring industry back. It's about the reindustrialization of the United States, that somehow you can rebuild a manufacturing giant that we were in the 50s and the 60s, or according to Trump in the 1890s. And the second, which is more current to the 1890s, the belief that you can cut taxes, income taxes, because you can compensate with revenue from tariffs. Of course, all of that suggests, in a pretty fundamental way, that what we have today ain't going to go away, and what we have today is revolutionary in post-World War II global economics, which is a tariff level of 10% on every country, 25% on autos and auto parts, 25% on aluminum and steel, and 25% on trade with Canada and Mexico that is not covered by the USMCA, the U.S. Mexico America trade agreement, the Canada trade agreement. So we got a lot of tariffs still coming. I know Prashant wants to jump in, but Giles, I want to get you back in here too. Prashant.
I wanted to pick up on a point that Prashant made, actually, saying that there was no legislative basis for this. Question, is there in fact a legislative basis for intervention by Congress? Elizabeth Warren had a piece in the FT this week arguing just that because Trump is using emergency powers, I forget the name of the exact bill, that very bill also has provision for Congress to intervene and countermand the executive. Is that correct? And is there any chance of it?
Well, so there's two elements to that, Prashant. I don't know if do you want to answer that, or so there are two ways. One, there are now two bills in the House and in the Senate, bipartisan bills being introduced to negate these tariffs because they are being because Congress, and this is what Elizabeth Warren has said. I think more interestingly, because actually getting the Republican Congress overruling President Trump's going to be hard. More interesting is a legal pathway. And the Koch brothers, of all people, have now are suing the administration for misapplying this emergency, which would have been targeted to a particular industry or a particular country and worldwide. And this case will make it to the Supreme Court. The problem, no doubt, is by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, in some ways, the damage has already been done, and in ways that I think Liz and Prashant have people, CEOs are not going to trust capital markets, etc. That's a big problem. Prashant?
Yeah, just one other thing that I think, while we have this conversation, I think we should be careful. I think I fall into the trap too often of trying to understand the other side's argument to some degree, and this is obviously chaos all over the place when it comes to tariffs. But there is, a kind of bipartisan consensus in the United States that, the hauling out of manufacturing in the United States has been a long-term strategic misstep by successive administrations, something that the Biden administration did try to correct through the CHIPS Act, through, the onshoring of sort of semiconductor manufacturing, and, Palantir CEO has a book out that everybody's talking about how actually, you have shareholder value, but actually you also have to sort of, for national defense purposes, have to have a sort of domestic manufacturing chain. And one of the kind of things that I think people do look back on Trump 1 as sort of highlighting that seems to have reached broad consensus is the kind of onshoring of manufacturing, particularly reducing dependence on a strategic rival such as China, is a worthwhile cause that is not necessarily, economical, but is worthwhile. Now, this, I see definitely, I think most economists would reasonably conclude that this is not the way to go about it. But the underlying argument that the hollowing out of American manufacturing, particularly in sort of the Midwest and sort of places that used to be strongholds of kind of American kind of economic growth, there is something lost there that, yes, is perhaps not the best thing for GDP, but has other sort of non-sort of economic values when it comes to national security, national defense, sort of, maintaining your country as a holistic entity, especially one as big as the United States.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point, Prashant, to make. But let's stick with you because the other big tariff story is the China story. And the United States runs a massive trade deficit with China. That also means that the United States imports a massive amount of goods from China. And those goods are becoming very, very expensive. And a lot of them are intermediate goods that are going to come into that will affect even U.S. production and capabilities. So talk a little bit about this standoff between the United States and China, and what it tells us about what Trump is trying to do, and also what Xi is trying to do, because Xi's not backing down. I don't think he's going to, by all accounts.
Yeah. So, in terms of a summary, you sort of got into how sort of tariffs are 145% now from the United States on Chinese goods. China today raised its tariffs on American goods to 125%, says it will, ignore any further American tariffs. Yeah. Who knows now? All of this has happened in the past week. And so I think we should be a little bit cautious about assuming that any of this will stay in a steady state for any time. But as you note, the Chinese have a substantial trade surplus with the United States. And so in theory, they will, Chinese manufacturers and kind of companies will suffer. Goldman Sachs yesterday reduced its forecast for Chinese economic growth this year and next year by 0.5 percentage point each year. So really substantial sort of shaving off of projections for Chinese economic growth as a result of these tariffs. So we should not assume that only the United States loses, right? This is a classic example of both countries losing in this trade war in a variety of different ways. Both countries also have leverage over one another, even though China in theory is vulnerable because of its substantial trade surplus. It has huge supply chain advantages when it comes to rare earths, to the refining of rare earths and minerals, when it comes to the sort of supply of huge numbers of goods at, as you say, reduced costs. Major American companies, including Apple and Tesla, are highly dependent on China for their supply chains. And these are not things that are only dependent on low-cost labor, actually. Chinese labor has increased in cost pretty substantially over the past 20 years. Tim Cook talks about this all the time, that actually what China has innovated on is its astonishing supply chains internally and its huge amount of talent. This is not something that will move, in the next sort of 2 weeks because of tariffs. So the cost to all of us will be substantial from these tariffs. Now, will either of them budge? I think it's going to be difficult for a couple of reasons. One of which is, I think one of the through lines of the first Trump administration through to the second one is a kind of consistent belief that China has violated the norms and practices of trade since its accession to the World Trade Organization, some 25 years ago, and that the United States was mistaken in supporting China's accession to the WTO. And basically that this has led to the long-term, as I mentioned earlier, hollowing out of American manufacturing, et cetera. Now, economists dispute the kind of causality there. That being said, this is now, I think, consensus within the Trump Republican Party. I think the second reason that this is unlikely to budge is also because Xi Jinping has not shown a willingness to pivot on policy priorities over time, and has shown also a willingness for China to take a huge amount of pain to maintain his policy priorities. The best example of which was zero COVID, during which, despite most of the world relaxing its COVID policies and accepting mRNA vaccinations, China did not for a protracted period of time, which led to huge amounts of debt, personal loss to the Chinese people, huge amounts of continued borrowing that local governments are having to suffer through. So, I'm sure one can always hope that things will get better, but the trend lines certainly seem to be extremely negative.
Liz, how do you see the relationship? This is really coming down to two men in some ways. Xi Jinping, who controls, as Trump admiringly says, 1.4 billion people with an iron fist, and Donald Trump, who seems to be controlling at least the political scene in the United States, neither of whom are people who lose face easily. So how do you see this playing out? And should we be worried that it may escalate, that it goes beyond trade and it starts getting into other areas of disagreement? And ultimately, as we saw in the interwar period, trade wars leading to actual wars.
Yes, it's a huge concern. I totally agree with Prashant that neither side is going to back down. So that means, where are we? I think that means it comes down to a question of which side can absorb the most pain. Both are going to hurt a lot. And if you look at it on balance, probably Xi can absorb more pain than Trump, because Xi has no checks and balances on his power. Xi is an absolute authoritarian leader with the power of the security state behind him. Chinese don't dare move against their government. They did a little bit. They stirred a little bit during COVID, and it didn't work, and the policy remained tough. He just has to look over his shoulder for something like a Tiananmen-style kind of unrest situation. That's really, really unlikely, given the tight hold that Communist Party has over all aspects of life in China. Trump has checks and balances. He has a Congress that could turn against him. He has a Supreme Court that doesn't always do his bidding. I think one of the fears is that in his refusal to back down, he would take that further and further in America and bring even more authoritarianism to America. But as long as we don't have that, the balance of pain is with Xi, because he can control his country better in the face of that pain. So, yes, I can't help feeling that China has the advantage in this whole situation long term, because it can control its situation domestically. It does have a lot of trade with the rest of the world. I think one concern as well, some countries like in Europe have, is that we're going to see a flood of cheap Chinese goods that were destined for America, bringing down markets here, competing with manufacturing and businesses here. And then do we have to get the same cycle starting up everywhere else in the world, where they end up having to put tariffs on China? And then if we have like a long-term standoff over this, and America is suffering a lot, I would worry that she would see this as a good time to go into Taiwan, or to make more aggressive moves on Taiwan if he sees a weak America and he thinks that he has an advantage, that the world is in chaos, so he could vote for Taiwan. That would be my worry.
Giles, I think Prashant and Liz really put two very bleak pictures on there. And I think I'm glad that Liz brought also up the worry in Europe and in many other countries of the surplus, export surplus that China has now making its way to the European markets, and what it's doing there for European competitiveness. Take whatever piece you want and elaborate or add some other thing that we haven't yet thought of, some other horrible thing that can happen that we haven't thought of. Or maybe an optimistic view.
Maybe it's Friday. Just on the risk of Chinese dumping in Europe, Ursula von der Leyen has already indicated that measures are already in place to prevent Chinese dumping, and that she's willing to use it. I don't know how that plays out, but I do want to disagree with Prashant and Liz on the assumption that neither of these two men will back down. For my money, that one of the lessons of the past 3 months is never underestimate Trump's ability to disguise capitulation as victory, or at least as a deal. I mean, what he says almost never bears any relation to reality or to the truth. But I can perfectly well see a time in the next few days or weeks when he blinks in relation to China, as he did in relation to the rest of the world, and rescinds the very high tariffs that are currently in place, and couches it as a deal. He has said, in fact, in the last 24 hours, I think, we can still make a deal with Xi. His chief China hawk, Peter Navarro, has been described by Elon Musk as a moron, and seems to have retreated somewhat from or been excluded somewhat from Trump's inner circle, and replaced as the principal face of the tariff policy by Besant, the Treasury Secretary. So I think there are signs that even though the China play is on steroids, that there's an antidote as well in the form of a climb down.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's well to remember, we saw this week, where literally a climb down was described as a great negotiating victory, although nothing was negotiated. And all of a sudden, if the art of the deal means that you back down and without any consequences, then I'm sure we can find lots of negotiators on the other side doing that. But Prashant, just to finalize this, if we assume that perhaps they're going to find some way to see if they can get a deal, is there a way for the United States, so the United States had a really hard time to get to Xi Jinping, who doesn't want to talk to the president. until he knows what it is that they're going to talk about. And that's not Trump's way. There does seem to be one person in Trump's orbit who has real influence in China and real influence in the United States, and that's our good friend Elon Musk.
That is true. And I guess among the questions are, what is Musk's staying power in this administration beyond May, when it looks like, there are multiple reports that his status as a sort of government employee will have to lapse because he's on special status for the security clearances that he has. I think one of the difficulties, though, is Musk embodies a willingness to deal with China that, while Navarro is on the extreme end, is certainly not in keeping, I would say, with the mainstream of Trump administration thinking. Even if you were to take sort of Rubio, Hegseth, Waltz, these are people who have been China hawks their entire lives. Hegseth to the extent that he's had a public profile, but they have been sort of fairly serious China hawks. The other thing is, the lesson to some degree to take from this first Trump administration is that Trump did strike a phase one trade deal with China. But for the years that followed it, the White House alleged that China violated all the terms of that deal. And that actually did not purchase the sort of soybeans and other agricultural products that they promised to, et cetera. Argue, of course, that was derailed by COVID. There are multiple reasons for that. And so I think the legacy of that, frustration with that sort of phase one trade deal and the fact that we never got to phase two does weigh to some degree on how negotiations to the extent they might happen. But I think the bigger factor is the one you highlighted, which is that Xi Jinping does not go into negotiations unless he knows what is about to happen. And certainly his interlocutors do not put him in that position unless they know, because, the nature of an absolute autocracy, as Liz has noted, is you're not going to put the number one person in a position where they may lose. And you do not know what the sort of world of possible outcomes is. And so as a result, it is, just unlikely, it feels, that there will be that kind of bilateral trade negotiation that one assumes Trump wants. And sort of Trump believes he is successful at. So to get to the point where, to Giles' point, which I think is correct, right? Like this ability to sort of paint defeat as success or whatever, like sort of deals as unbridled kind of victories. You have to get to the point where you get to the negotiation first. And that's where I worry, is actually that, the Chinese system at the moment, at least, sort of protects Xi from conversations which, his aides and interlocutors do not believe he will win. And that's simply, you just don't know where a kind of negotiation with Trump will go. And I think that's where the bottleneck might be.
None of these issues are going to go away anytime soon, and we will have to watch it very closely, both on the tariff side and, of course, on the U.S. China side. Giles, do you want to jump in?
Just one more point again about the optics of this. I'm really struck by the contrast between the radical transparency of the way this administration operates. So you have frequent press conferences, frequent interviews, and above all, the unmediated statements on Truth Social. So we can see the process, but at the same time, to the same degree, we have no idea what he wants, where this is going to go. It's a paradox that afflicts our take on everything this administration does.
Yeah, it's a golden time for journalism, except trying to figure out, in the sense that you have a lot of things to talk about, but trying to figure out what it actually means is a little bit more difficult. Liz, talk about surprising, perhaps or perhaps not, developments is what will happen tomorrow when we will have the U.S. Supreme Negotiator on all things critical, Steve Witkoff, meet with the Iranian, we don't know whether they're going to meet, but they're going to be at least in the same place to talk about, I guess, from the Iranian side, relief from sanctions, and on the U.S. side, an end to the nuclear program. How did we get to this point? And what do you expect to happen in these first conversations, if they in fact will be a conversation?
Well, yes, in trying to figure out what's going to happen in the Iran talks, you run into the same problem that you have with China and tariffs. And as Giles just said, and you just said, if you don't know what Trump wants, then how do you know where the talks are going to go? I think it's fairly easy to figure out that Trump does not want war. I mean, people generally don't want war. He seems very committed to not wanting war. He vaguely wants peace. But what that means and where it where that could go with Iran is really quite hard to figure out. And my worry is that we'll end up with a situation a bit like Ukraine, where Putin tells him, yes, I want peace. And he says, oh, great, look, Putin wants peace, and announces that he wants this peace deal and a ceasefire with absolutely no thought as to how to implement it, how to supervise it, how to enforce it. And so I think one of my worries in the Iran deal is that the Iranians have figured out that that you can run rings around this Trump administration, and that they will make vague promises, and we'll end up with a bad deal that won't be well implemented, that won't be well enforced. And that will give the Iranians sanctions relief in return for not that many promises, which is a little bit what we had with the Obama administration. What the Obama administration's deal showed was that you do have to have buy-in from allies who are directly affected by Iran's policies in the Middle East. The Obama administration did not do that. They did not get the buy-in of the Gulf countries. They did not get the buy-in of Israel. They did not get the buy-in of Republicans. So you had a deal that was going to unravel the minute an opponent of it took office. And you could have the same thing that will unravel just because everybody will disagree with it and everybody will start running rings around it. But yes, at least they are talking, and we're not going directly to war, which was one of the fears after at the time of late January, when the Israelis seemed to think they were on a roll and would get Trump's support for bombing Iran. There's a disagreement already about whether they're going to be meeting directly or not. Trump says it will be direct. Maybe he doesn't know exactly what he's talking about there. Or actually says, the foreign minister of Iran says, no, it's not direct. I think one of the things to look for is whether they're staying in the same hotel in Oman or not. In Vienna, they never stayed in the same hotel. European mediators shuttled between the two delegations at the two hotels, taking messages between them. And there were some efforts to set up direct meetings, but they weren't. If they're in the same hotel, you might have them bumping into each other in the elevator or something like that, or running into each other at the breakfast buffet. Some kind of direct meeting could be maneuvered. And as for what's on the agenda, yes, Iran is looking for relief from maximum pressure. It urgently needs sanctions relief. Trump's goal is to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon. That's all he said is the goal. So, that's not unlike where we were at the beginning of the Obama administration talks. Iran wanted relief from the sanctions it already had. Obama wanted to halt the nuclear program. So it's not impossible that a deal can be done at all. I think on the plus side, both sides are coming to this from a position of considerable weakness. The Iranians have just had their deterrence value to Israel completely wiped out. The point of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the point of all the militias in Iraq and Syria was to deter Israel from ever attacking Iran by promising or threatening retaliation directly inside Israel from all these proxy forces on Israel's border. They have now been so weakened, it's not clear Iran can use them at all to make any dent on any Israeli attack. And we know that their air defenses were taken out by the exchanges, the airstrikes that Israel did earlier this year. So Iran is really quite in a weak position at the moment. And I think the Trump administration is in a weak position too, because Trump's barged into Ukraine and the war is continuing. He's not getting peace there. There isn't peace in Gaza. That ceasefire didn't last. Now he's got egg all over his face over these tariffs. And the whole world has decided that, he can't be trusted and doesn't know what he's doing. And the Iranians will be looking to exploit that. So yes, both sides are coming at this from a position of weakness, which I think encourages the possibility of a deal. But at the same time, I'm not sure Trump's team is capable of making a deal, and that the Iranians are willing to trust Trump again after what they see as a huge betrayal that he did to them the first time around. When he cancelled the deal in 2018, it was egg on the face for the moderates in the Iranian government, and a big victory for the hardliners in the government who said we should never make a deal with the great Satan. And it will take a lot more in the way of concessions this time around for Iran to do a deal with the US.
Yeah, that's. I think, Liz, you really laid it out well, and sort of this decision tree, which on the one hand suggests mutual weakness should lead to a deal, but on the other hand, it may actually be the weakness that on both sides that will make it harder to get to a deal in some ways. Prashant, how do you see the lineup? And I think Liz hinted at it, what I think is a really important issue. Nuclear weapons are complicated and highly technical discussion. You know, when the Obama administration had John Kerry as its lead negotiator, they also sent the Secretary of Energy, who was a nuclear physicist, Ernie Moniz, in order to make sure that the details could be worked out on the verification and everything else. Steve Witkoff has never seen anything like this, and yet he is the lead negotiator. How do you see it?
And yeah, the dynamics in some ways don't bode well. You know, Witkoff is actually meeting with Putin right now in the Kremlin, and so you know, there is. I mean, if you were to make a case for why there is still some hope here, right? Is all the points that Liz raised, which is like, look, the fact that they're talking at all is remarkable. And kind of astonishing after the last sort of year and a half of what happened post October 7th, and certainly, you know, Trump's history of ripping up the JCPOA previously, right? And yes, you know, Witkoff is not the sort of nuclear kind of policy savant that one would sort of assume would be at the core of this. But, you know, Chris Wright is touring the Middle East, or will be soon, for 2 weeks. And so the point that Liz earlier raised about, you know, the Obama administration failing to get sort of Gulf buy-in, in some ways, the Trump administration is much better positioned to do this. And Chris Wright, you know, has a lot of respect in the broader energy sector as somebody who is just like very smart and willing to sort of take unorthodox policies that are outside of the Republican mainstream, as a former renewables investor and all these kinds of things. So I think there is like a lot of sort of, he has cachet that we should not underestimate. Now, diplomatic cachet is something obviously very different. Now, all of that being said, I would broadly sort of agree with, you know, everything Liz said. And actually, in some ways, I'm even more downbeat because to some degree, you know, I think one of the sort of genuine long-term Republican frustrations with the sort of Iran deal was that it was too concentrated on the nuclear program and not sufficiently on Iran's proxy activities and Iran's missile program. And so sort of that has been a consistent Republican frustration for the past decade and longer. And so sort of broadening an already complicated deal to include the missile program, support for Hezbollah, Hamas, et cetera, and the Houthis, I think makes it, you know, extremely unwieldy. And the Journal had a piece just yesterday about, you know, events have also progressed since 2015. Iran's nuclear program is much more advanced. And so reining it back and pulling it back, now you're talking about like a Libya-like scenario where we have to hope that Iran gives up its nuclear program sort of voluntarily a la Gaddafi. And I think the legacy of that is something that I don't think the Iranian sort of leadership will be willing to countenance. So I am broadly very downbeat, and basically everything Liz said is something I would associate myself with.
Giles, how do you see it? And two interesting players mentioned by Prashant and implied by what Liz said. Vladimir Putin, and the idea that Witkoff, which I didn't know, which is good news to hear, or good news, it's news, is in Moscow talking to Putin. Of course, in the last meeting between Lavrov and Rubio, they talked about Iran being an issue for Russia-U.S. cooperation, so that might suggest something. And the other figure is Benjamin Netanyahu, who was deeply embarrassed in the Oval Office when the president sprung on him that they were going to do talks with the Iranians, the arch enemy of Israel, and significantly weakened, as Liz Wright said, Liz rightly said, through its military action. So Netanyahu can't be happy with this conversation happening, and Vladimir Putin may seem, if I can be useful in Iran, then maybe I can get what I need on Ukraine.
Quite possibly. Putin doesn't control Iran's nuclear program, but Russia, of course, has been intimately involved in it. And so he could be a player, and that is presumably one of the things that he and Witkoff are talking about. I agree with you entirely on Netanyahu. Israel, of course, was opposed to the initial Iran deal. And while I agree with Liz that Trump is broadly in favor of peace whenever it's offered. That seems to me doesn't eliminate at all the possibility of unilateral Israeli strikes on the Iranian nuclear weapons program, which, as Prashant pointed out, is more developed than it was, and the trend of Israeli military activity over the past 2 weeks, with a full-throated return to war in Gaza, their sense of being on a roll after the elimination of proxies all around, and their overwhelming need to prevent Iran obtaining nuclear weapons, and fear of a weak deal. I mean, I hate to sound a downer on a Friday afternoon as it is on this side of the Atlantic, but whatever Trump wants out of these talks, it seems to me that Netanyahu is the wild card.
Yeah, I think that is probably right, which is why Liz's fear of a bad deal breaking down earlier seems to serve at least the Trump himself very much. But whether it serves anybody else and whether they're allowing it to happen is going to be the thing to watch. So, and we will watch it. We will watch it again here next week on another edition of World Review. In the meantime, highlighting what was quite a week. I can't think of 3 people I'd rather do that with on a Friday afternoon here in Europe, and Friday morning in the United States. And Liz Sly, who used to be with the Washington Post, is now a journalist at large. Giles Whittell, who's with Tortoise Media, and Prashant Rao, who's with Semaphore. Thank you all 3 for your contributions. Thank you all for watching and tuning in and listening to the program. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.